Kinda.
Hello. We're going to get started now. All right. So thank you all for coming. I hope you're enjoying other events at the symposium yesterday and today. And so welcome to the panel discussion on outliers and environmental literary criticism. So we're going to begin with Brianna Burke reading Reciprocity, What Environmentalists Can Learn from Native American Literature. She's an assistant professor in the Department of English. Her academic interests are in the environmental humanities, including eco-criticism and multicultural ecologies, but she's particularly invested in environmental justice. She's the author of 2 articles, Fighting Reds on-screen and off-screen, Ronald Reagan as Cold War politician and cowboy and cattle queen of Montana, and The Great American Love Affair, Indians in the Twilight Saga, both of which examine representations of Native Americans in popular culture. Currently, she is working on a book that explores the intersections between environmental ethics and Native American cultural and religious traditions. So, that'll be all said. Thanks.
Just this. Grab my water. Good morning. It's nice to see so many faces today. I think I can speak for all 3 of us when I say that we're proud to be part of the Wildness Symposium this year. And we want to thank the Creative Writing Department for letting us add our voices to their fabulous event. And I'd like to thank Matt for organizing this panel, too. So, when Matt asked me to speak on the theme of outliers, I knew that wouldn't be difficult for me. Most of the voices I regularly think about could be considered outliers because they belong to the periphery, to those underrepresented groups. They're among the best voices in American literature today, but they're not considered as such. Rather, they're Asian, Chicana, Black, Native. And so today I want to consider some of the indigenous voices and what they have to say about environmental theory and practice. It has long been my opinion that the environmental movement as a whole has neglected non-white, non-traditional thought when constructing environmental ethics. This is nothing new in Euro-American society or even within academia, and so it's no surprise that it's reflected in modern environmental thought. But for a long time now, we have seen that Euro-American ideology and practice concerning nature has had devastating consequences throughout the world. And in changing our attitudes, I think it has become necessary to reach outside of the mainstream, to consider what other peoples have to offer us. As I'm fond of pointing out to fellow academics in the environmental humanities, contrary to popular thought, Aldo Leopold did not invent the land ethic. And I say that with a good dose of Indian humor, which is both joking and serious. Leopold's work challenged the philosophical constructs of the very people who needed to be reached most. But nevertheless, indigenous peoples were practicing the land ethic long before white people inhabited Native America, and they've continued to do so, even if in mediated forms. Native voices also offer a way to think around what I consider one of the most consistent and glaring problems within the environmental humanities, and actually within academia as a whole to varying degrees of severity, which is the gap between theory and practice. As we work to change attitudes about the place of the human animal in relationship with its biosphere, we've often neglected to think about how our theory should be enacted within the world, beyond the action of asking people to rethink. That action is a very important first step on a long journey to revising our relationship with the natural world, but we can't stop there. Nor is it enough to urge responsible or green consumption, because it doesn't undermine the very ideology that gets us into trouble in the first place, which is consumption itself. And so, although it may be a radical suggestion in our times, I think we need a new system of thought that guides our everyday choices if we are going to cause real change. And today I want to show you the way indigenous value of reciprocity might offer a solution flexible enough to fit both individual and communal needs. In breaking over this theory and making it comprehensible, I want to honor the intellectual tradition that it comes from by using the method Native peoples employ to teach. And so I want to tell you a story. And given the spirit of the occasion, I don't think anyone will mind. One day on his travels, Raven finds a dead animal. Now, when I say raven, I mean the bird. Not a human named Raven, but a bird. Is everybody with me? Yeah? Okay. So Raven finds a dead animal. It doesn't matter what kind of animal it is, although I know people love details, so let's just say it's a deer. But the important part is that it's whole, unbutchered, and uneaten, and dead. Raven, who, if you know anything about Raven, is quite a cunning creature, is excited because it means he can eat without doing any work that day. And like all of us, on occasion, Raven indulges in laziness. So he takes part of the deer home to feed his wives, and we would like to think that perhaps he feels grateful for his luck. Then the next day he finds another dead animal, this time a rabbit, also uneaten, also dead. And again, Raven isn't alarmed. He takes the rabbit home and doesn't tell his wives that he found it. And then the next day, he finds another dead animal. And the next day, another. And the following day, yet another. Dead animals everywhere. Deer and elk, buffalo and foxes, rabbits and coyotes, hawks and pheasants, and finally one day, a bear. So many bodies rotting on the plains. Raven begins to feel uneasy, but he has also come to like not having to hunt for himself. Life has become comfortable, and eventually, after a time, he becomes a little portly. Not fat, exactly, just, a little chubby. It's a little harder to lift himself off the branch, that's all. But to his credit, Raven is a smart being, and his unease grows. One day his wives begin to question him. He hasn't left the house very much, and yet they have so much food. To what do they owe this luck? Where does this food come from? And Raven, whose conscience has become heavy, finally confesses everything. His wives get angry. They push him out of the nest, henpeck him, if you will, into finding out what has killed so many animals. Now let's pause here. Why exactly are his wives upset? After all, Raven is provided, and all of them eat meat, so it's not as if they're upset because the animals are dead. Each living being lives off of other living beings, and taking lives to continue our own is nothing new, nor is it shocking. What disturbs Raven's wives, and Raven himself, if he were honest, is the amount of bodies, the scope of the deaths, the fact that the thing killing doesn't eat its kill. This is wasteful and ungrateful. Killing an animal without eating it says that you have no respect for that animal's life or being, that you kill it not because you are hungry, but simply because you can, which in a traditional society is a sign of mental, and this is very important, social imbalance. To kill more than one can eat shows a lack of awareness that other things need to eat too, and that all animals, including human animals, depend on the vitality of the ecosystem around them for survival. In other words, what disturbs Raven's wives is the disregard for interdependence. This is one of the ways this narrative speaks with silence. In Indigenous stories, often what is left out of the text or is implied says as much as what's included, because most of these narratives, spoken or written, presuppose an audience with similar cultural values. But let's get back to our story. Raven flies around looking for help and sees a true human being, a man he knows and has helped before. We could say a man who owes him a favor. He tells his friend about the dead animals and asks the man to help him solve the riddle. And of course, this man agrees to help Raven. This thing killing indiscriminately threatens this man's life too, and the lives of his people. So he hunts down the killing thing. And when he finds it, it is not right. It is not human, not animal, something else altogether, strange, broken, perverted by its power. In other words, the embodiment of what is considered evil in Native ideology. The man kills the thing. How is not important, but what is important is that balance is restored. For now. Now, the story might seem strange. After all, aren't we grown-ups, and didn't we stop believing in talking animals a long time ago? Isn't that anthropomorphizing? Aren't I romanticizing a primitive past to extract a pretty obvious lesson? Certainly in our modern times, the story seems fantastical. But continually in North American indigenous cultures, one hears stories about animal and human-animal communication. Sometimes in reading these stories or in hearing them from elders or storytellers, the person telling the story will say, "See, long ago, animals could talk to humans." And then they usually follow it up with, "But somewhere along the way, we lost that ability." We hear this time and time again in American Indian studies. So we need to step outside of our Euro-American cultural constructs to understand that talking animals are no more strange than many of the beliefs that Euro-American Christians hold as true. Within Native cultures, everything communicates. And humans, when we were more open to our environment and less distracted by modern conveniences, were able to understand. And yes, this story does teach some pretty obvious lessons. That everything is connected and depends on everything else for life, that waste is socially irresponsible to the lives of those around us as well as to our own well-being. And maybe it teaches us that we shouldn't be lazy, or maybe that women are more socially responsible. Clearly, this story argues that the indiscriminate killing of things for food, which we all participate in due to the modern food system and the industrial manufacturing of animal flesh for human consumption, will in the end change us, turn us into things, perverted by our own appetites and power. And in this last lesson, we see the value of reciprocity. Now, when I say reciprocity, I don't mean the simple action of equal exchange as we might think of it. In other words, I don't mean that if you use paper, you should plant trees, although you should. Rather, reciprocity, as it is defined by Indigenous people, speaks to something much deeper and more complicated. Reciprocity in Indigenous thought is linked to the idea that human animals are just one small part of creation, that we aren't even the most important part. The creation of this planet is cooperative and communal and takes the effort of all beings, and that creation is ongoing. If this is the case, you might ask, if we are co-conspirators in creation, isn't hunting and eating other beings the violation of the very idea that we live in cooperation with them? However, reciprocity does not argue that we all must become vegetarians, vegans, or fruitarians, because part of the condition of being human means having to take from the earth to survive. So our only job as true human beings is simply to maintain a balance in the world or the ecosystem around us. Seems simple enough. And yet, we can look around us and see that if maintaining balance is the only job creation gave humanity, we have failed horribly. If we lived by the value of reciprocity, we would recognize that for everything we take, we must also give. And as I said, this isn't a simple one-to-one correlation. It argues instead that we must atone for our consumption first by showing gratitude and recognizing the worth of lives of beings around us, animal, plant, insect, stone, which is implicit in the relationship between Raven and the man. Reciprocity demands that we atone for what we must take through helping the landscape flourish by maintaining biodiversity and taking only what we need. And when we cannot always do that through performing a ceremony, through the ritual recognition of the act of survival as violent itself, and through humbling ourselves in relation to all of creation, which is so large and so miraculous, how could we ever be so arrogant as to assume we are supreme beings within it? You can see already how practicing a belief in reciprocity would fundamentally change our interaction with the world. It would demand that each of us know where our food comes from, how it is produced, who grows it, who has to die so we could live. And it wouldn't just apply to food, but to everything we get from our world and how we live within it, which are the very parameters we use to categorize and think about the behavior of other species. It would ask us to give back in equal measure, participate in the system that keeps us alive, instead of extracting ourselves from it. And if we had to give back for everything we took, in whatever form that takes, it is easy to see how we would cultivate a culture of awareness that would help us realize the repercussions of each of our daily actions. Reciprocity is just one of the many ideas Indigenous intellectual thought offers, and I didn't have to reach very far to find it. The story I shared today about Raven and the dead animals wasn't located in some moldy tomb of ancient oral narratives collected by anthropologists in the 1880s, nor was it told to me as a child growing up. I found it in James Welch's Fool's Crow, written in 1987, although like any good storyteller, I took some liberties. This isn't to say that oral narratives don't have value as mediated texts, but I do want to point out that modern American Indian literature has a great deal to teach us. These writers, regardless of whether or not they grew up on their tribal reservations or in cities because of the Urban Relocation Act, continue to work within an intellectual tradition that envisions the world in a radically different way from Euro-American conception and practice today. Reciprocity echoes throughout N. Scott Momaday's Housemaid of Dawn, when Abel kills the albino who symbolizes evil, or when he performs the ritual run to heal himself and his community. It speaks in Leslie Marmosilko's Ceremony, when Teo performs the bear ceremony to atone for the violence in Vietnam, when he causes a drought by praying for the rain to end, or even when he and Josiah sprinkle corn pollen on the nose of the deer, feeding its spirit and thanking it for giving its life to continue theirs. In fact, in any native text where we see ceremony, a medicine person, or human and animal interaction, reciprocity resounds. It guides the actions of the characters in Louise Erdrich's tracts, Bingo Palace, or her Plague of Doves. It shapes the behavior of the people in Linda Hogan's Pulitzer Prize-nominated People of the Whale. And I could go on and on. These are just some of the commercial American Indian writers, the popular ones who are lucky enough to be read by mainstream society, and yet still, they reference and emphasize a worldview that is cooperative and living, that is connected with the idea that creation is ongoing. So therefore, we can make the choice to change our behavior, to contribute instead of taking, to come back to our role of true human beings. I could go on, but I think I'm running out of time, right? So let me finish by saying that, in practice, the relationship between the environmental movement and indigenous peoples has not always been easy. And this is true for a lot of reasons. But I do think it is time, when considering our environmental ethics and behavior, to reach outside of business as usual, to those outlying voices that envision the world and our place within it in a completely different way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brianna. That was fantastic. So next up is Matthew Wynne Civils, reading of Outliers and Archives, tracking Paul L. Arrington's Of Men and Marshes. Formerly a wildlife biologist, Matthew Wynne Civils is now an assistant professor of English at Iowa State University, where he teaches American literature before 1900, as well as courses devoted to American environmental literature from all periods. He has published several scholarly articles on topics in those specializations and has edited 3 editions of the writings of Muskogee Creek poet and nature writer Alexander Posey, which were published by the University of Nebraska Press. He's the founder and co-editor of the award-winning scholarly journal, Literature in the Early American Republic, and is currently working on a monograph about the origins of American environmental prose. His edition of Paul L. Arrington's nature writing classic, Of Men and Marshes, is forthcoming from the University of Iowa Press.
Thank you. I'm really impressed with this turnout. It's one of the bigger turnouts I've had. I usually have to present in a phone booth. In his 30-year career, the famed Iowa State University wildlife biologist Paul L. Arrington earned an impressive list of honors. Arrington, who counted Aldo Leopold as a friend and mutual influence, was twice presented with the Wildlife Society's Award for Outstanding Wildlife Publication of the Year. He appeared in the December 22, 1961 issue of Life magazine, where he was listed as one of the top 10 naturalists of his day, a group that also included Rachel Carson, Joseph Wood Crutch, and Roger Torrey Peterson. Just a few months before his unexpected death in 1962, he was awarded the American Wildlife Society's Aldo Leopold Medal for his accomplishments in wildlife conservation. In addition to books on marshland ecology, he published approximately 200 scientific papers and popular articles on over 35 different species of birds and mammals. As Thomas G. Scott wrote in Arrington's obituary in the Journal of Wildlife Management, to read all of Dr. Arrington's writings would constitute a liberal education in many facets of ecology, wildlife management, and conservation. And perhaps no other of his many works best embodies all of these elements, nor presents them in as an accessible a form as Of Men and Marshes. This 1957 classic draws insights not only from Arrington's biological fieldwork, but also from his experiences as a hunter and trapper, and from his early days exploring the marshes of rural South Dakota. Arrington reveals his deep knowledge of the glacial marshlands he so admired. Examining the marsh from a dynamic range of perspectives, he opens by inviting us to consider how immense spans of time, coupled with profound geologic events, shape the unique marshland ecosystems found across the Midwest. He then follows this wetland environment across seasons and over the years, creating a compelling portrait of a natural place too little appreciated and too often destroyed. Arrington records his experiences with hundreds of wetland creatures, reminding us of the intricate relationships between the marsh and the animals who call it home. He follows minks and muskrats, snapping turtles and pelicans, red foxes and blue-winged teal, all while underscoring the human responsibility to preserve this remarkable and fragile environment. Arrington's Of Men and Marshes remains an evocative reminder of the great beauty and intrinsic value of the glacial marshland, an ecosystem fast disappearing before the blade of human degradation. Later this year, the University of Iowa Press will, as a result of my own efforts, bring Of Men and Marshes back from an unjust oblivion. In writing the introduction to that edition, I spent a lot of time with his papers, housed in the ISU Library's Department of Special Collections. I've always found archival scholarship to be somewhat like following tracks through a forest. In navigating the wilderness of letters and files, of wrong leads and unexpected treasures, I have come to a much better understanding of what went into this classic book, and I want to share that with you today. The theme of this symposium is outliers, and Paul Arrington fits that term well. Malcolm Gladwell, in his 2008 book called Outliers, promotes the idea that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to really become an expert at a task. Arrington's hours on the job far exceeded even that. As a young man in rural South Dakota, he spent his formative years hunting and trapping in the marshlands of that state. He then worked for some time as a professional trapper, literally living off of the land. When he entered graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, he embarked on a career in which he made good use of his practical wilderness experience by applying that knowledge to the creation of the relatively new science of wildlife ecology. During his career here at Iowa State, he conducted an epic series of wetland research projects. He conducted field studies in Iowa, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Nebraska, Georgia, Florida, the Canadian provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and elsewhere. I sound like Johnny Cash, I've been everywhere, man. It's estimated that he spent 32,000 hours studying Iowa marshes alone. As one of his colleagues put it, Arrington was as acclimated to marshes as the muskrat itself. Through his extensive research, he did nothing less than completely reshape our understanding of how predators and other environmental factors affect the populations of prey animals. Arrington's research triggered a wholesale reconsideration of the factors influencing environmental degradation. Understandably, Arrington also wanted to share his ideas with a larger, more popular audience. But as an employee of the state of Iowa, he had to make sure that during work hours he devoted his time solely to research and writing of a technical nature. Popular writing, even of the scientific variety at that time, did not count and was viewed as a potential misuse of state funds. So after years of writing in his spare time on what he jokingly called his Sunday morning manuscript, Arrington's draft for Of Men and Marshes slowly began to take shape, and by the end of 1954, he was ready to shop it around to publishers. His first attempt was with Knopf, whose editor Philip Vaudrin reluctantly turned down the book because, while admitting that he liked it very much, he even said he would buy a copy as soon as another press published it. He was not convinced that the book would find a profitable audience. Arrington next sent the manuscript to Macmillan, along with the copy of the rejection letter from Knopf. He told the Macmillan editors that he felt he should share with them Knopf's reasoning for rejecting the book. But he also explained that the Knopf editors had misunderstood his intended audience. He wrote, The readers that I have in mind are not especially the professional conservationists and research groups, but the general class that responded so favorably to Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. Macmillan's editor saw promise in the book, but requested a substantial revision before considering it for publication. By March 1956, however, with the revised draft in hand, Macmillan's editors remained uncertain about the project. To help settle the matter, the editor of their outdoor books department, Carol H. Woodward, took an extra step to gauge the possible profitability of the book. She told Arrington, "I feel that the best way of putting this book across, no matter who publishes it, is to do so through the various wildlife and conservation organizations." So she arranged to attend that year's wildlife conference in New Orleans, where Arrington shepherded her to the various meetings of different wildlife organizations. Woodward was looking for assurances from these organizations that they would promote the book to their constituencies. And upon her return to New York City, she seemed confident the book would sell. And in August 24, 1956, she wrote Arrington informing him that they were ready to offer him a contract. With Macmillan's contract came yet another request for revisions, which Arrington in a letter described this way. Aside from the expected little things, the smoothing of constructions and so on, Miss Woodward advised getting rid of some of the blood and dead ducks and dead muskrats. Not all by any means, but enough to make for pleasanter reading. For most of his career, Arrington had published with ease in elite scientific journals, but now he was learning the ropes of commercial publishing. To reach a popular audience, he would have to revise the manuscript's tone, and he would have to temper the sometimes gory reality of the marsh with its blood and dead ducks. But he agreed that such revisions would improve the chances that the book and its conservationist message would appeal to a wider readership. When it was published in 1957, few of, if any, books had taken as their sole topic the beauty and biological richness of the Midwestern glacial marshlands, and no previous book had so eloquently expressed the dire need to save the endangered American wetlands from drainage and other forms of human encroachment. Reviewers from scientific journals and popular magazines alike praised the book. The New Yorker lauded it as a book that succeeded in explaining marshland ecology to the layperson while also highlighting the human values inherent in the ecosystem. Quote, "He speaks to us here not as a scientist but as a man and a human. His method is to show us a marsh as his home, to escort us through it in the various seasons of the year, and let us see for ourselves the beauty and wonder that are there, a telling and moving experience." William Vogt, in a more ecologically dire review for the Journal of Wildlife Management, feared that sights he describes from his boyhood will not be seen again in this cycle of American civilization, if ever. Vogt was all too correct when he lamented that 50 years from now, the kind of phenomenon he is currently recording may have vanished. Arrington's book may be at once history and prophecy. While numerous environmental themes emerge from Of Men and Marshes, perhaps the most constant and the most indicative of Arrington's joining of ecological and philosophical concerns is his idea that the marshland ecosystem is a precariously ordered realm and one that has an inherent right to exist. Still, he is not overly idealistic. He never loses sight of the fact that human interests are part of the land use equation. He refers to this idea on the first page of the book in his preface, where he writes, "We need cornfields and economic bases for our civilization, but we also need marshes where they may be said to belong." This concept of natural belonging, especially as it relates to certain key species, reemerges throughout the book. Quote, "In spring, I always feel that the marshes belong to the ducks." Later on, he writes, "No species thrives where it does not belong." Later on, "Over most of the continent where glacial marshes occur, the marsh edge may be said to belong to the minks as much as to any single form." He concludes by expanding the idea of natural belonging from marshlands to the entirety of the planet. "We need not feel overcritical of man," he writes, "for looking out for his own interests, including means of livelihood, but neither need we commend his heavy-handedness in dealing with the exploited earth, and with the other living things that belong on the earth, too. In describing the ecology of marshland islands, he reminds us that our power over the land comes at a cost. He writes, "There is friction between crowded individuals, and there is exploitation of the exploitable, and there is death on the islands. But with man largely out of the scene, the processes of living and dying have the sanction of a timeless order. Of course, modern man is of life also, yet his dominance and his faculties for upsetting so much of the rest of life serve to rule him out of what we think of as natural relationships of living things." Arrington's perspective is one born of a lifetime of pragmatic but principled land use, and he is refreshingly unencumbered by misplaced idealism or flights of spiritual fancy. He respects the sovereignty of wild land and invites us to do the same while recognizing that it represents a timeless order that we must value, even if we have largely removed ourselves from it. Many of the marshland ecosystems Arrington studied and loved have since been severely damaged or completely drained, often to make room for more cropland. In a 2006 study, Pritchard et al. Examined aerial photos of 7 Iowa marshes Arrington frequented in his research. They found that since Arrington's day, the marsh environment available at these sites had decreased 34%, while the amount of developed land at these locations had increased 26%. Combined, these sites were found to have experienced a 60% increase in open water, often to accommodate recreational boaters, but with no thought of how that increase of open water dramatically reduces habitat for marshland wildlife. Over the past several decades, the muskrat, perhaps the single species that most fascinated Arrington, has suffered a dramatic decrease in population, a decline directly connected to the loss of marshland habitat. That so little of the glacial marshland ecosystem that Arrington admired still exists reveals how poorly humanity has heeded his warnings and how poorly we understood his rationale for valuing an ecosystem for its intrinsic worth and not its potential for individual gain. We have been poor students of a remarkable teacher. At the present rate of wetland destruction, Arrington's cautionary book will increasingly transform from an appeal to save the marshlands to a eulogy for the wild places he once hoped we would save. Still, there is hope that a new, perhaps more ecologically sophisticated generation will be ready to learn from Arrington's guidance. Science tends to overwrite the contributions of its innovators, updating, modifying, obscuring the original genius of the ideas upon which it builds. But in Of Men and Marshes, Arrington created a literary legacy that is now more pressing, more vital than ever. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So next up is Jeremy Withers. He's going to read Horses, Warfare, and Becoming Human. Jeremy Withers is a lecturer here at the English department at Iowa State University. His research focuses on the intersections between warfare and nature, as represented in medieval texts, as well as on environmental readings of contemporary American literature and film.
Thank you, and good morning. I'd like to apologize first off to anyone who might have showed up today expecting to hear me talk about medieval text. I did at one time float around a title for my talk that suggested as much, but I changed that title. So I'm still going to be talking about animals and warfare, just bumping it up about 600 years. Okay, so if asked to think about warfare of the 21st century, most people's thoughts would turn to images of cutting-edge medieval military technology, laser-guided smart bombs, radar-avoiding stealth aircraft, remote-controlled predator drones. And if asked to reflect back upon warfare of the 20th century, people's minds would likely brim with images of the newfangled technology of that era: tanks, machine guns, aircraft carriers, nuclear-powered submarines, and atomic bombs. But despite the abundance of machinery and sophisticated technology in military conflicts of this century and the last, we moderns still have not shed our dependence on animal power and animal companionship during times of war. As we know from the SEAL Team 6 raid to kill Osama bin Laden, dogs are still airdropped in with even the most elite American soldiers, and as recently as last month, news agencies reported that the U.S. Navy was considering using mine-detecting dolphins if Iran tried to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. Put another way, even though animals are still outliers in our anthropocentric society, and even though they certainly possess an outlier status, military status, compared to the integral role of machinery like Humvee Jeeps or Black Hawk helicopters, animals still play a significant role in even the most technologically advanced armies. In this paper, I would like to analyze how two works, the novel War Horse by Michael Morpurgo, upon which the recent Broadway play and recent Spielberg film are based, and how the nonfiction work Horse Soldiers by Doug Stanton remind their readers not only of the vital role animals have played in the 21st and 20th century combat, but also how both animal-human bonds and human sympathy for animal suffering allow soldiers to perform and enact their fundamental humanity at a time when it is most under assault by the dehumanizing horrors of warfare. I begin with Doug Stanton's nonfiction work, Horse Soldiers, subtitled The Extraordinary Story of a Band of U.S. Soldiers Who Rode to Victory in Afghanistan. As the subtitle suggests, Stanton's book focuses on U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks. More specifically, Horse Soldiers focuses on a small contingent of U.S. Special Forces soldiers who arrive in Afghanistan a mere 2 months after the Twin Towers have fallen to assist and fight alongside the Northern Alliance, a military political organization consisting of the various ethnic groups of Afghanistan that are fighting against the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The extraordinary aspect of this story that Stanton foregrounds is that these highly trained Special Forces soldiers, who are frequently shown in the book using high-tech devices like satellite phones and laser-guiding devices to call in smart bomb attacks, also find themselves forced to travel the countryside and to fight the Taliban the way the Northern Alliance soldiers have been for years, on horseback. Obviously, then, on one level, Stanton's book is about the resilience, flexibility, and toughness of the American military. However, a more subtle, but to me more noteworthy, interest that Stanton has in these highly trained soldiers' interactions with horses is that for him, such interactions allow the soldiers to display a type of humanity deemed correct and fundamental, as well as display their distinction from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters, and even from the Northern Alliance soldiers alongside whom these Special Forces soldiers fight. Throughout Horse Soldiers, there are constant attempts by Stanton to humanize the Special Forces soldiers his book focuses upon, and to show that they are as far away as possible from being hardened, callous killing machines. For example, Stanton spends an inordinate amount of time telling us about what kinds of marriages the Special Forces soldiers have, how in love with their spouses they are, what the emotional phone calls back home from Afghanistan are like, and so on. And it is here, with these humanizing strategies, that these Special Forces soldiers' reliance on equine power and equine modes of transportation during their military campaign in Afghanistan becomes so useful to what Stanton wants us to perceive about these elite American soldiers. Repeatedly, Stanton shows the Northern Alliance soldiers, who are the allies of the Americans in their fight against the Taliban, to be incredibly callous towards their cavalry horses and pack mules, treating them like insentient machinery rather than living creatures. In one scene early on in the book, Stanton describes how, quote, the Afghans loaded items onto the mules, who stood with their knees locked under the weight, trembling. One of the mules would not stand still, and so the Afghans beat it with a leather crop fitted into an ornate brass handle. And elsewhere, when describing how the horses would collapse in exhaustion from the relentless traveling of the Northern Alliance army, Stanton informs us how, quote, the Afghans did not feel sorry for the horses. They walked up and beat the animals with stiff whips until the animals rose silently and trudged on, end quote. These are men obviously hardened by many years of war and incapable or unwilling to let concern for animal welfare slow them down in their drive to defeat the Taliban and al-Qaeda armies. The American Special Forces soldiers, on the other hand, are clearly depicted as cut from a different cloth. For example, Stanton relates to us how, after witnessing the Afghans beat an overburdened pack mule with the leather crop, one of the Special Forces team leaders, Captain Mitch Nelson, quote, wanted to say something about beating the animal, but he didn't, and how Nelson, quote, could tell the guys on the team, the other American soldiers, felt the same way as him. And when the Afghans thrashed their weary horses in an effort to get them to move again, Stanton narrates for us how Sergeant First Class Diller, another Special Forces soldier, quote, would stand there, hands on hips, feeling sorry for the animal, end quote. Even though the military conflict in Afghanistan, described in Stanton's book, involves a complex hodgepodge of actors, ranging from Northern Alliance Afghans to Taliban Afghans, and from American soldiers to foreign Chinese and Chechen al-Qaeda operatives, it is clear that Stanton asserts that what truly separates the Americans from all the other military actors is, among other things, their compassion and sensitivity towards the animals in their midst. As the medievalist scholar Bruce Holsinger has recently discussed, the post-9/11 textual landscape is awash in depictions of Taliban and al-Qaeda soldiers as technologically and culturally backwards. As Holsinger describes it, many Bush-era American officials have depicted the agents of the 9/11 attacks as separated from America and Europe, quote, not primarily by religion or region, but by time. In this temporal bisecting of the world, America's enemies inhabit an unchanging medieval space, end quote. Interestingly, however, the Taliban and al-Qaeda, so often associated with non-technological medievalness in Holsinger's analysis, are in Stanton's book, Horse Soldiers, instead repeatedly associated with the technology of inorganic machinery. Put another way, we never see the Taliban or al-Qaeda soldiers utilizing medieval horses. In lieu of horses, the Taliban forces have instead availed themselves of the mechanical detritus left over from the bloody Afghan-Soviet war of the 1980s. For example, in one scene from the book, when Captain Nelson peers through his binoculars at the enemy below, he sees, quote, several Taliban tanks, Russian models called T-52s, as well as several artillery cannons known as Bimpis, in which come armed with 100mm gun, a 30mm cannon, and 3 machine guns bristling from the blunt metal bow, end quote. Whereas the good guys, especially the American good guys in Stanton's narrative, are associated with a sensitive bond to non-human forms of life, the Taliban and al-Qaeda, conversely, are associated with menacing machinery. The Taliban and al-Qaeda's humanity, in short, is not on as robust display through the weaponry and tactics they employ to fight as it is with the American horse soldiers. Furthermore, the Taliban and al-Qaeda forces are not only often identified with inorganic, lifeless machinery, but they are also clearly depicted as aggressors towards and killers of animal life. For example, when describing a devastating attack involving Taliban-launched rockets, Stanton describes us with a graphic image of how the horses of dead Northern Alliance soldiers, quote, were in pieces around them. The blast had split one horse in half, lengthwise, so the animal was laid out on a pile of its own guts, and its feet were spread in all 4 directions as if staked to the ground, end quote. Clearly, even though both sides are responsible for an immense loss of life in this conflict, and even though the Americans and Northern Alliance soldiers are responsible for riding the horses into harm's way to begin with, the Taliban and al-Qaeda soldiers will be remembered by the readers of Horse Soldiers as people who not only support terrorist attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C., but also as monstrous eviscerators of animals, as villains akin to the maligned vivisectionist of the 19th century who flayed animals alive. If we now turn to Michael Morpurgo's Warhorse, a 1982 novel set in England and France during World War I, we find that Warhorse is interested every bit as much as Horse Soldiers in the humanizing effects of kindness towards animals during times of war. A quick synopsis of the novel goes as follows. Told from the perspective of a horse named Joey, Warhorse begins at the outbreak of World War I, when Joey, the beloved horse of a farm boy named Albert, is sold by Albert's unscrupulous father to the British cavalry and shipped to the front lines of France. Joey is soon caught up in the war, while back home, Albert, the farm boy, cannot forget Joey and eventually enlists in the British Army, embarking on a mission to find his horse and bring him home. One significant difference, however, between Warhorse and Horse Soldiers is that whereas Stanton's book suggested that certain behavior and attitudes towards animals was a useful way to keep the heroes and the villains neatly separated, Warhorse strives to deconstruct and undermine the notion that heroes and villains are, in fact, stable and distinct categories. In other words, Warhorse aims to show its readers that categories such as hero and villain are relative and are often the result of a relentlessly churned out propaganda that demonizes and dehumanizes the enemy while simultaneously glorifying and ennobling one's own cause. The way that the novel and the film and the play based upon it carry out this process of destabilizing the hero-villain binary is through its narrative arc of having the main horse character, Joey, fall under the control of first the British Army, then some French citizens, and finally the German Army. Along each step of Joey's journey, he finds people of each nationality who treat him and some of the other horses with dignity and compassion. For example, after Joey is taken by the Germans from his idyllic existence among a French grandfather and his granddaughter, he ends up becoming a workhorse on a horse team that is responsible for pulling heavy German artillery guns into position, a grueling task accompanied, Joey tells us, by, quote, continual exposure, underfeeding, and hard work, which result in few of us having any hair growing on our lower legs, and the skin below being a mass of cracked sores. Like all the others, Joey tells us, I found every step I took excruciatingly painful. End quote. Thus, for a moment, the Germans appear to be the coarse and cruel savages that the Allied forces likely depicted them as being in their propaganda, and they appear to be as inhumanly indifferent to animal suffering as the Taliban and some Northern Alliance soldiers appeared in Stanton's book to be. However, Morpurgo works to undermine such seemingly monolithic depictions of the German army by then providing us with an elderly German character called Friedrich, a gentleman, Joey calls him, quote, whose whole nature cried out against fighting a war, end quote. In fact, in one of the more memorable lines of the novel, this aged pacifist, who is referred to as crazy old Frederick by the other Germans, at one point tells Joey and his equine companion Topthorn, quote, it's the others who are crazy. They fight a war and they don't know what for. And it's me they call crazy? You two are the only rational creatures I've even met in this stupid war. End quote. This one old German soldier thus shows that Germans are capable of seeing the insanity and the vainglory of war, and even of perceiving intelligence and an inherent dignity in animals, such as horses. Of course, the moral centerpiece of the novel is a scene near the end in which Joey gets caught in the middle of that dangerous space between the trench lines known as no man's land. Amid some of the barbed wire found there, Joey becomes hopelessly entangled. Eventually, both British and German soldiers can see from their respective trenches a horse stuck out on the wire, and each side sends out a soldier who is willing to risk his personal safety in order to see if he can help the struggling horse. At this moment, the guns momentarily fall silent, and the hostility and rancor of the battlefield subsides, having evaporated in the face of a shared sense of pity for animal suffering. Two soldiers, a German and a Welshman, meet up in the middle of no man's land, overcome their initial suspicions of each other, and eventually free Joey from the lacerating barbed wire. This important scene ends with two soldiers who only moments ago were trying to kill each other with poison gas and machine gun bullets, exchanging pleasantries such as, quote, we have shown them that any problem can be solved between people if they can only trust each other, and, quote, take care, my friend, and good luck. Unlike in Stanton's book, the seemingly clear divide between the categories of good and bad, hero and villain, dissolve completely. Each side displays an appropriate humanity that, responding to the pain of a non-human other, allows them, at least for the time being, to demonstrate and to embody forth. In How to Make a Human, Carl Steele's recent study of medieval animal-human relationships, Steele argues that what many pre-modern people in the West perceived as manufacturing and maintaining an authentic human identity was a scripturally sanctioned practice of violently subjugating and controlling animals. But what we have seen occurring in the two texts I focused on here, Horse Soldiers and Warhorse, was a reversal of what Steele argues occurs in the Middle Ages. Rather than proving one's fundamental humanity and distinction from non-human others by dominating, killing, or eating animal forms of life, what Stanton and Morpurgo consistently return to in their respective books, is the notion that what separates good guys from bad guys and human heroes from less than human villains is an appropriately benevolent attitude towards animals. Furthermore, both writers perceive kindness and respect towards animals as a reliable bulwark that allows well-intentioned soldiers who are just doing their job to preserve a sense of moral purity and innocence in a military conflict that threatens to position all combatants under the unsavory category headings of killer or murderer. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. So right now we have about 5 minutes left before we have to wrap up for questions and answers. So if anyone has anything they want to ask, you can just address the presenters directly, Matthew or Brian or Jeremy. Justin.
I have a question, I guess, that kind of straddles Dr. Mason presentation. A lot of modern environmentalists will give some semblance of credit, at least, to Native peoples for ideas of conservationism and things like that. I was curious, if I remember correctly, Aldo Leopold as well kind of gave some credit to Native people. I was curious if Arrington had any influence from Native ideas of conservationism or
He did. Yeah, I think he did. He never really articulated it that way, but he had, and growing up in South Dakota, and then also when he was a trapper in Canada and also in northern Minnesota, he had run into indigenous peoples there, and in writing about them, he comments that the generosity and the environmental, the respect that they have for the environment struck him and stayed with him. So yeah, but as far as articulating it in a more overt way, no, he didn't.
Jeremy, it seems another difference in the stories, the two stories that you're talking about. In the Warhorse story, people are reaching across culture, but they're kind of in the same time, the same technological moment. And so the humane treatment of animals seems to be a shared thing. But in the Taliban, the Afghanistan story, there seems to be a stretch across not only religious cultural differences, but a technological time difference. So that people are coming at the animals, they're kind of mediating them in a different way.
Okay. So you think it seems like Stanton is, I don't know, realistically sort of depicting kind of a medieval kind of people who are depicting animals in a way that's just blatantly not like modern day Westerners are depicting it, maybe? Okay.
There's less of a shared technological and cultural moment.
Yeah.
I guess that's not a question.
Yeah. Observation. Yeah.
Matt, I was interested when you were talking about belonging, and then I started thinking that maybe what really matters is the preposition that goes with belonging, because belonging on and belonging to means something different. And is there, does Ehrlich use the preposition intentionally to make it
I haven't noticed that. Largely, I think what he's concerned of, as a person who spent his life studying predator and prey relations, especially between the mink and the muskrat, is that they, at different times of the year, belong to the environment in different ways, and actually belong to each other in different ways. So there is this larger, more, I guess, three-dimensional way of thinking of belonging in place that also involves time. So that belonging there at that moment, or belonging to that moment, the comment about minks sort of belonging at the edge of the marsh at a certain time of year. So it seems to be that term of belonging, which I think is he has a very complicated idea of what it means to belong, and it actually, I think, varies across the seasons, and also across the relationships that various organisms have, which was at the time a very sophisticated environmental worldview, a lot more than most land managers had at that moment. So I have no great answer for that, but I think it is contingent upon which animals, where, and at what time.
Okay. Yeah, we have time for one more quick question. Yep.
Right, well, I have two really quick ones. Brianna, for you, you talked about these kind of mainstream voices like Silco that we have read. If you could maybe recommend for us one outlier voice, indigenous voice that maybe we don't, I would love to hear that recommendation. And then just quick, Jeremy, for you, a question. This kind of, in the more recent text that you were describing, the American text in Afghanistan, is there any vestiges left in this kind of man-horse, soldier-horse relationship, vestiges of the American frontier? Because certainly some of the things I saw coming up after 9/11 was a resurrection of that nationalist rhetoric of the frontier. You know, Osama bin Laden wanted, dead or alive. I just wonder if there's vestiges of that kind of cowboy relationship with force. So two quick questions.
Well, in Stanton's book, actually, I made note of this when I was reading it and sort of analyzing the text. So I didn't do much of it in the talk, but he does bring up the frontier and how much these soldiers think of themselves as cowboys and how much they do look at themselves as sort of, yes, being sort of the newer form of the sort of cavalry of the 19th century. And they're definitely he's definitely depicting them as a sort of new embodiment of that. And of course the other thing that comes up occasionally is sort of like almost like medieval references to they look at themselves as like new knights in armor kind of the 20th century, 21st century. So both of those are definitely sort of feeding into glamorizing them and making them seem more in a more positive light what they're doing. They're not backwards, they're not medieval in a negative sense. They're bringing back this chivalry and this frontier ethos that we've unfortunately lost. Yeah, it's definitely in there. Great.
As for writers, Alison Adele Hedge-Cook, who writes actually about Iowa and this area, she's a poet. Simon Ortiz, who's just now getting the recognition he's deserved for 30 years. But really, anything out of Arizona Sun Tracks, any of those fiction books are really great. They're writers who are writing not for a huge commercial audience, but because they think that their message is important. And so that includes really great works.
Great. All right, thank you guys. We have to wrap up now, so one round of applause. And stick around for the Flyway reading next.